The Supreme Court just dropped a bombshell that has sent shockwaves through Westminster and exposed what might be the most serious betrayal in modern British political history. Keir Starmer, the already disgraced former Prime Minister who was expelled from Parliament for corruption, has been struck down by the UK's highest court over a secret EU scheme that he deliberately concealed from Parliament and from the British people. This isn't about the corruption we already knew about, the £124,000 in payments or the billions in fraudulent contracts. This is something far more serious, far more treacherous and far more dangerous to British sovereignty and democracy. The Supreme Court ruling reveals that while Starmer was Prime Minister, he entered into secret agreements with European Union officials to gradually reintegrate Britain into EU structures, effectively reversing Brexit without parliamentary approval, without public debate, and without telling anyone what he was doing. He negotiated in secret, he signed agreements in secret, he committed Britain to obligations that undermined the democratic decision of the British people to leave the EU, and he did all of this while publicly claiming to respect the Brexit referendum result. The level of deception is staggering, and the constitutional implications are catastrophic. The Supreme Court hasn't just ruled that what Starmer did was wrong or improper. They've ruled that his actions were fundamentally unconstitutional, that he exceeded his authority as Prime Minister in ways that threatened British sovereignty, and that the secret agreements he made are void and unenforceable because they were never properly authorised by Parliament. This ruling goes beyond anything we've seen before because it's not just about personal corruption or financial misconduct. It's about a Prime Minister who attempted to overturn one of the most significant democratic decisions in British history through secret deals and deliberate deception. The court found that Starmer had been negotiating with Brussels from almost the moment he took office, that he'd promised EU officials Britain would rejoin key EU structures within 5 years, and that he'd agreed to align British law with EU regulations in ways that would make formal rejoin virtually inevitable. All of this was done behind closed doors, with no parliamentary oversight, with no public knowledge, and in direct contradiction to what Starmer was telling voters and MPs about his Brexit policy. The secret EU scheme that the Supreme Court has now struck down began shortly after Starmer became Prime Minister, when he initiated confidential discussions with European Commission officials about what he called repairing the relationship between Britain and the EU. On the surface, this seemed like normal diplomatic engagement, the kind of thing any Prime Minister might do to improve relations with important neighbours and trading partners. But what the Supreme Court investigation uncovered was that these discussions went far beyond normal diplomacy into actual negotiation of binding commitments that would fundamentally alter Britain's relationship with the EU without anyone knowing it was happening. The evidence presented to the court showed emails, meeting minutes, and draft agreements that revealed Starmer had committed Britain to regulatory alignment with the EU across multiple policy areas, including trade, immigration and financial services. He'd agreed to accept European Court of Justice jurisdiction over certain disputes, effectively allowing EU courts to override British law in specific circumstances. He'd promised to make substantial financial contributions to EU programmes despite Britain no longer being a member state. And most significantly, he'd agreed to a timeline and framework for eventual British re-entry into the single market and customs union, with the explicit goal of full EU membership being achievable within a decade. All of these commitments were made without informing Parliament, without seeking any kind of parliamentary approval, and without telling the British public that their Prime Minister was actively working to undo the result of the Brexit referendum that had been held just years earlier. The legal challenge that led to the Supreme Court ruling came from transparency advocates and Brexit supporters who had obtained leaked documents suggesting that secret negotiations with the EU were taking place. Initially, Starmer's government denied that any such negotiations existed, claiming that all engagement with the EU was routine diplomatic communication that didn't require parliamentary notification. But as more evidence emerged, including testimony from EU officials and from British civil servants who had been involved in the negotiations, the denials became impossible to maintain. the government shifted to arguing that even if negotiations had occurred, they were within the Prime Minister's executive authority to conduct foreign policy and didn't require parliamentary approval unless and until any agreement was actually finalised. This argument was legally sophisticated but politically disastrous because it essentially admitted that secret negotiations to reverse Brexit had been happening while claiming that hiding them from Parliament was perfectly legal. The Supreme Court was asked to rule on whether a Prime Minister could commit Britain to international obligations that fundamentally altered the country's constitutional relationship with the EU without seeking parliamentary approval. The court also had to determine whether the secret nature of the negotiations and agreements violated constitutional principles about parliamentary sovereignty and democratic accountability. The case was heard over several weeks with extensive evidence presented about what exactly had been negotiated and what commitments had been made. The Supreme Court's ruling was unambiguous and devastating for Starmer and for anyone who had been involved in the secret EU scheme. The court found that the negotiations and agreements exceeded the Prime Minister's executive authority because they involved fundamental questions about British sovereignty and about the constitutional relationship between Britain and the EU. The judges ruled that such matters required parliamentary approval under both constitutional convention and statutory law, particularly given that Parliament had explicitly authorised Brexit through legislation that reflected the referendum result. The court held that attempting to reverse or fundamentally alter that democratic decision through secret executive action violated basic principles of parliamentary sovereignty and democratic governance. The ruling stated that the commitments Starmer had made to EU officials were void and unenforceable because they lacked proper constitutional authority. But the court went further, finding that the deliberate secrecy surrounding the negotiations represented a serious breach of the Prime Minister's duty to keep Parliament informed about significant government actions and decisions. The judges noted that the secrecy couldn't be justified by any legitimate government interest in confidential diplomacy because the negotiations weren't about tactical details that might be sensitive, but rather about fundamental constitutional questions that absolutely required parliamentary involvement. The court's language was remarkably strong, describing Starmer's conduct as a serious abuse of executive authority and fundamentally incompatible with democratic governance and parliamentary sovereignty. This was the Supreme Court essentially accusing a Prime Minister of attempting to overturn a democratic referendum result through deception and abuse of power. The immediate reaction to the Supreme Court ruling was explosive across the political spectrum. Brexit supporters were vindicated in their suspicions that Starmer had never accepted the referendum result and had been actively working to reverse it through any means available. They pointed to the ruling as proof that Remain politicians couldn't be trusted to respect democratic decisions they disagreed with and would resort to secret schemes to overturn the people's will. The anger among Brexit voters was intense and personal, viewing Starmer's secret negotiations as a fundamental betrayal not just of Brexit, but of democracy itself. If a Prime Minister could secretly negotiate away a referendum result, what was the point of voting or of democratic processes at all? The ruling confirmed their worst fears about the establishment's willingness to ignore or undermine democratic decisions. Remain supporters faced a more complicated response, with some defending the principle of closer EU ties even while acknowledging that Starmer's secret approach was wrong, while others condemned both the secrecy and the attempt to reverse Brexit without new democratic mandate. Political parties across the spectrum recognised that the ruling represented a constitutional crisis that transcended normal partisan divisions. Even MPs who personally supported closer EU relations acknowledged that attempting to achieve that through secret prime ministerial negotiations was completely unacceptable and represented a serious threat to democratic governance. The opposition parties that had been calling for Starmer's accountability on the corruption scandals now had additional ammunition, pointing to the EU scheme as further evidence of someone who fundamentally didn't respect democratic processes or constitutional limits on power. The details that emerged from the Supreme Court case about exactly what Starmer had negotiated and promised to EU officials were shocking in their scope and their implications. The agreements that had been reached in secret included commitments that would have bound Britain for decades and that would have made any future attempt to diverge from EU policy extremely difficult or impossible. Starmer had agreed that Britain would adopt EU regulations across vast swathes of economic activity, essentially accepting rulemaking from Brussels despite having left the EU specifically to escape such external control. He'd committed to maintaining free movement of people from EU countries, directly contradicting one of the main arguments for Brexit and one of the key concerns that had motivated Leave voters. He'd promised substantial annual payments to EU budgets, meaning British taxpayers would be funding EU programmes without Britain having any voting rights or influence over how that money was spent. The financial commitments alone ran to billions of pounds annually, money that would come from British taxpayers to fund an organisation they had voted to leave. Most troublingly, the agreements included provisions that would have automatically aligned future British law with EU legislation in key areas, meaning that Parliament would have lost the ability to make independent decisions about regulations affecting British businesses and citizens. This represented a fundamental transfer of sovereignty back to Brussels, achieved not through open debate and democratic decision, but through secret negotiations that deliberately excluded Parliament and the public from any input or oversight. The Supreme Court ruling specifically addressed why Starmer's actions were so serious and why they couldn't be allowed to stand. The judges wrote extensively about the importance of parliamentary sovereignty as a foundational principle of British constitutional government. They noted that major decisions about Britain's international obligations, and particularly about relationships that affect sovereignty, must be made with parliamentary approval and public awareness. The referendum on EU membership had been held specifically because the question was recognised as being of such fundamental importance that it required direct democratic input for a Prime Minister to then secretly negotiate away the result of that referendum through executive action violated the most basic principles of how British democracy functions. The court emphasised that this wasn't about whether closer EU ties were good or bad policy. That was a political question for Parliament and voters to decide. The constitutional violation was the secrecy and the abuse of executive authority. The attempt to make fundamental decisions about Britain's future without the democratic processes that should govern such decisions. The ruling made clear that no Prime Minister, regardless of their personal views or political objectives, has the authority to commit Britain to international obligations of this magnitude without proper parliamentary authorisation. The fact that Starmer had attempted to do so and had deliberately hidden what he was doing represented such a serious abuse of power that it called into question his fitness for any public office. The political consequences of the Supreme Court ruling were immediate and severe, adding yet another layer to the multiple crises that had already destroyed Starmer's career and reputation. The ruling came after he had already been expelled from Parliament for corruption, after he had been humiliated outside Downing Street after his party had suffered catastrophic electoral defeat. This new revelation about secret EU negotiations seemed almost like piling on, except that it exposed misconduct that was arguably even more serious than the financial corruption that had led to his expulsion. Attempting to secretly reverse Brexit represented a betrayal of democracy itself, an assault on the fundamental principle that major constitutional decisions should be made by voters and their elected representatives rather than by prime ministers acting in secret. The Brexit debate had been one of the most significant and divisive in modern British history, with passionate arguments on both sides and ultimately a democratic decision through referendum. For Starmer to have attempted to overturn that decision through secret deals fundamentally disrespected everyone who had participated in that democratic process, regardless of which side they'd supported. Even many Remain voters who would have welcomed closer EU ties condemned the approach Starmer had taken, recognising that achieving such a major policy change through deception rather than through open democratic debate was wrong and dangerous. The ruling reinforced the broader narrative about Starmer that had emerged through all the scandals. Someone who believed rules and democratic processes didn't apply to him, who thought he knew better than voters and could therefore justify any method to achieve what he considered the right outcomes, who was willing to lie and deceive to avoid accountability for his actions. The criminal investigations that were already examining Starmer's financial corruption now expanded to include potential charges related to the secret EU scheme. While the scheme itself wasn't necessarily criminal in the sense of breaking specific statutory laws, the deception involved and the potential misuse of public funds to support the secret negotiations raised questions about misconduct in public office and about whether Starmer had lied to Parliament when asked about EU negotiations. Lying to Parliament is a serious offence that can carry criminal penalties, and the evidence showed multiple instances where Starmer had been directly questioned about whether negotiations with the EU were occurring and had denied it, or had given misleading answers designed to conceal what was really happening. Prosecutors were examining whether these false statements rose to the level of criminal conduct or whether they were merely political lies of the kind that usually face political rather than legal consequences. The distinction mattered because charging a former prime minister with crimes related to policy positions and diplomatic negotiations raised complex questions about where the line between political accountability and criminal liability should be drawn. But the Supreme Court's strong language about abuse of authority and the deliberate nature of the deception suggested that this case might cross that line into actual criminal conduct rather than just political wrongdoing. Legal experts debated these questions intensely, with some arguing that criminalising policy deception would set dangerous precedents, while others contended that such serious abuse of power and such fundamental betrayal of democratic processes had to carry consequences beyond just political defeat. For the British public, the revelation about the secret EU scheme crystallised everything they had come to understand about Starmer's character and his approach to power. This was someone who fundamentally didn't respect democracy or trust voters to make the right decisions. He'd believed that Brexit was wrong and that he knew better than the millions who had voted for it, and he'd been willing to use his power as Prime Minister to secretly undo their decision without giving them any say in the matter. The arrogance and the contempt for democratic processes that this demonstrated were breathtaking and confirmed the worst suspicions that many had held about how Remain supporting politicians viewed Brexit voters. The fact that Starmer had been willing to engage in such fundamental deception while presenting himself publicly as someone who respected the referendum result and who was working to make Brexit succeed made the betrayal even worse. People could have disagreed honestly about Brexit policy, could have argued openly for reversing the decision or for closer EU ties. But choosing instead to work secretly to overturn a democratic decision while lying about it showed a level of dishonesty and manipulation that destroyed any remaining credibility. The Supreme Court ruling and the exposure of the secret EU scheme would stand alongside the financial corruption as the defining elements of Starmer's legacy. Examples of someone who achieved high office through promises of integrity, but who governed through deception, corruption, and fundamental disrespect for the democratic processes that had elevated him to power. The lesson for British politics was profound and would influence debates about executive authority, parliamentary sovereignty, and democratic accountability for generations to come. Starmer's multiple falls and the various forms of misconduct that caused them provided a comprehensive catalogue of how leadership can fail and how power can corrupt, serving as warnings about what to avoid and what standards must be maintained to preserve democratic governance.